Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming here today. Really appreciate it. I'm going to start with something a little bit different than your usual CAP event. I'm going to ask you just for a quick moment to bear with me with a little exercise here. Very simply, if you could just sort of close your eyes and think about something in the past, right? So maybe you think about a birthday party or a wedding you went to, or think about a school that you went to when you were younger and you're sort of kindergarten teacher. And I know it's still early in the morning, so don't fall asleep, but think for a few moments about this moment in the past. Now, when you did that, if you did really engage, and you can open your eyes now, you would have leaned backwards. A lot of studies shown that when you think about the past, that you lean backwards, and when you think about the future, you tend to lean forwards. What's interesting about this is that, I encouraged you to think with your body. So in a very literal way, your body engaged in cognition, it engaged in a form of reasoning. Right? I think at a really broader level, what happens often is when we think about thinking, right, we think that it is all with our minds, it's all with our brains, but we have a lot of evidence that suggests that we really think with our bodies, that our feelings, our emotions are deeply intertwined with the way that we think, the way that we reason. The studies on this, are really fun. If you, sit in front of your computer and you give your computer the middle finger, you will have more negative opinions about your computer than, its partner computer, even though there's nothing different, right? You, in that case, thought with your hand. Finger dexterity, right? Your hand-eye coordination is actually a great predictor of math ability. Interestingly, it doesn't predict reading ability, but again, we have a lot of evidence that our bodies, our emotions really underscore our thinking, right? Our learning. And this is important today because we are, of course, talking about social and emotional learning, and we really sort of underestimate sort of how powerful it is. And so this conversation today isn't so much about you thinking about your past as much as it's thinking about new education law that we have, the ESSA, as we've all been calling it. And before I sort of get into the panel, and we have a wonderful group of people here, and Catherine's going to introduce them, is to sort of discuss a little bit what we're talking about when we talk about social and emotional learning, right? Because if social and emotional learning is the same as sort of thinking in many cases, we should make sure we have some good definitions to make sure we're all on the same page about that. So for this event, we're really talking about kind of a subset of this field, learning mindsets, which refer really to students' beliefs, right? So do they believe that they can learn? Do they believe that their intellectual capacity is fixed, right? Or do they believe that they can grow, right? That their intelligence is something that they can develop over time. Students' beliefs also really matter about their sort of learning environment, about their school. Do they feel like their school itself is a place that is caring for them? It is a place where they belong, a place where they really feel engaged, right? We want students to feel comfortable, that sense of respect for others, respect for their peers, because we know that influences their learning. We also know that it influences the way that they engage in the world more broadly. And then we also want to think about learning mindsets when it comes to a sense of purpose, right? Do the students feel a sense of self-efficacy? Do they see meaning in their schoolwork? Can they connect, their learning in a very direct way to what they are experiencing in their own lives? And to be clear, this is a one-way street. We often think that, if we mention sort of Justin Bieber or sprinkle a little sort of, baseball on top of statistics, this is going to, make people interested. But really, this is a one-way street. We want to figure out ways that students, right, their mindset is that they see a connection to that work, that they've developed a sense of how they're going to engage in that work, that it's meaningful to them. So, this idea is important. One, because we know that it shapes learning, but also more broadly, these social skills, these mindsets are also really important for the world of work, for the world of college, right? That these interactions, these attitudes towards other people really are meaningful for the way students, experience really their lives. So the evidence is, quite clear on a lot of these issues, and hopefully I've convinced you by, at least leaning back that, this is in fact work that we should really be considering. But there's a lot of skepticism out there, and a lot of work that remains to be done to sort of express these ideas. So earlier this year, we did a study where we went out to the public and said, we interviewed about 3,000 people over Amazon Turk and said, do you believe that you can identify good teaching and learning? So people are, as they often are, very overconfident. So 70% of the public was like, yes, I know good teaching when I see it, excuse me. And, to a degree, this is like a been there, done that problem, right? People have gone to school, and since they've gone to school, they think like they know what good teaching looks like. But then we started asking them some questions about, effective practice. So what we found, though, is that a lot of members of the public were not able to identify good practice. And this was really important when it came to learning mindsets and skills. Over 70% of the public believed that it was actually good practice to praise kids for being smart. And what we know from the research from Carol Dweck and many others is that praising students for being smart encourages a fixed mindset and encourages students to not feel a sense of self-efficacy and really erodes their ability to work hard at a problem. So there is this public gap that we deal with. What we're going to talk about a little bit more here today is the gap also that we see in schools, right? That a lot of schools want to engage in this work, that they feel a sense of urgency around social and emotional learning, but how are they going to engage in this work? How can they roll out professional development programs to do this work? And how can they make sure that students feel comfortable in their schools? How can they make sure that their teachers are modeling these types of behaviors? And, when we talk about sort of learning mindsets and skills, we've, talked about attitudes, but the skills aspect of it is really important, and they're deeply intertwined. So we know also from the research that practices like rereading, practices like highlighting that tend to be passive and generally a little bit easy are not as effective as practices that tend to be a lot more difficult, like self-quizzing or explaining ideas to yourself. And so, again, we saw that in our own survey. The public is very skeptical of more active forms of learning, informal tests. We know formal tests have a bad rap, but informal tests like pop quizzes, formative assessments, similarly suffer from a bad reputation. But we know that they're really important for learning. We know that they're really important for teaching, and we need to figure out ways to interweave that into the classroom. So, here in Washington, we have a new law, and that new law offers us some good news. It offers us an opportunity to engage in this, and that's really what this panel is going to focus on today. The law is different. We have changed from the NCLB era. This law calls for a well-rounded education, shifting away from the narrow focus on academics. ESSA also requires state and local leaders to implement, quote, evidence-based programs, practices, and interventions. So we're going to talk about the implications of that, talk about the implications of social and emotional learning. We are partnered here today with the National Network of State Teachers of the Year. They've done some wonderful, wonderful work here, and we're really just thrilled to have this partnership together. Our report does look specifically at ESSA and kind of thinking about the new flexibilities under the law. What are these opportunities for policymakers to translate what we know about the research into effective classroom practice. NSTOI's report focuses on measures of social and emotional learning, right? So thinking more deeply about what are teachers' opinions on the use of these measures when it comes to teacher performance evaluations, when it comes to growing themselves as educators. The report is really important because it adds this very important aspect of teacher voice, right? If we're thinking about social and emotional learning, about raising students' voice, raising students' sense of self-efficacy, right? We need to also think about raising teachers' voice, raising teachers' sense of self-efficacy. I think it's really important also because, we are sort of pack animals. I know we don't like to think of ourselves that way. We like to think of ourselves as sort of, lone individualists who, are always thinking rationally. But we're pack animals, and when we think about social and emotional learning, this is really important, right? Because we want teachers to model these types of behaviors, right? I mean, nothing, in other words, nothing could sync a social and emotional program if it's a standalone program, right, where you're telling students, oh, you should have a growth mindset, the mind is a muscle, and then they go into math class and then that teacher, says, really you're born with math skills or not, right? This type of modeling is really key, and I think that's where the Enstoy's report, by really listening to teachers, hearing their voices, both their desires to engage in this work, right? We know teachers want to do the right thing, but also where their fears are, where they think that there could be a lot more capacity building. So I'm going to hand this off to Catherine, my partner here. We hope that you guys are all going to learn a lot from this discussion, and we want to make sure that it is a discussion and conversation. So we're going to have a little bit of a conversation up here, and then for about 45 minutes or so, and then really looking forward to what your questions are.
Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. I'm a middle school teacher, so I'm used to a lot of interactivity. I've already learned something, Ulrich, so thank you so much for those wonderful remarks. And I've learned that I truly have a reason for being so bad at math. I have no hand-eye coordination, so I appreciate learning that. Thank you. This morning we are going to have a conversation, and we'd like to invite you to engage in that conversation as we go along. We have an incredible group of panelists this morning. You've already met Dr. Ulrich Boser from the Center for American Progress. He serves at Center for American Progress as a senior fellow and director of the Science of Learning division here at the center. He is a reporter, an author, an incredibly exciting and interactive speaker, and we are honored to be here today with CAP doing this session. Next to Ulrich is Dr. Amalio Nieves, who has, I think, probably one of the most interesting jobs on the planet. In education, he serves as the Assistant Superintendent for Social and Emotional Learning and Wellness for Boston Public Schools. Think about that for a minute. What an incredible position. Next to him, we have Dr. Rebecca Snyder. Dr. Snyder is a member of Enstoy, which is how we pronounce our very long name. And Dr. Snyder is a teacher. She is an English language arts teacher at the secondary level in Western Pennsylvania in a very rural community. She is also a member of the Enstoy board. She is an amazing educator inside and outside of the classroom. And for this study that Enstoy has produced, Dr. Snyder served as one of 2 teacher researchers on this study. The way that we do our research is to pair our members who hold their advanced degrees with scientists in a partner organization. So next to Rebecca is Dr. Beth Glennie from Research Triangle International, and she was one of our 2 science partners on our study. She is at RTI. She is a senior education analyst, and Beth and Jeff, the other science partner with whom we worked, were just wonderful partners to do the work that we have done in the report that we're releasing today. I would like to thank the Rakes Foundation for their support of both of these reports. Without their support, I know for Enstoy, our report would not have happened. And we learned so much in doing this research. And Ulrich, I'm sure that was the same for you. So I would really like to give a shout out to the Rakes Foundation for supporting this important work. And I'm going to start this conversation with Beth. So Beth, in thinking about the work that we did in our report, and I know that you all have copies of it, what are some of the key findings that you would like to pull out from that study?
Well, this study was looking at questions of whether social emotional learning makes a difference in student academic outcomes, how teachers can use data to do this, and also should such information be used in accountability systems. And we really looked at 2 lenses for this. One was kind of a systemic review of research on the topic, And that really informed the way we set up our focus groups of teachers. And we talked to, we had 3 panels of focus groups of teachers and 3 kind of video sessions getting their opinions. And so from that, we learned a lot about kind of the state of the research and the state of practice on these issues. And from the research, we learned that these studies do, social emotional learning makes a difference. It makes a difference for students in terms of their academic well-being in many, many respects. And the teachers are probably the strongest influence within a school on a student's social and emotional learning. And so this is really something that's just so important, that we try to practice it. However, which skills are most important? Which interventions are the most promising? Do all interventions work the same way for all students? Well, those are some questions that remain to be answered. Perhaps a sense of belonging matters more if you're somebody who feels a little bit outside. Maybe for a female, to feel a sense of belonging in STEM would make more girls feel encouraged to do STEM. There's just all kinds of ways that these skills may play out a little bit differently, may matter more for some kinds of students. And some of those who develop these skills, measures of these skills, Angela Duckworth and Ron Ferguson, don't think they should be used in a teacher evaluation system, because that's not how these measures were designed to be used. And so with that kind of in our minds, we talked then with teachers about, as I said, in these focus groups, and really just ongoing discussions. And the teachers, these were all NSTOY teachers, right? So they had been recognized, they were experienced, and they were very passionate about including social and emotional learning in their curriculum. And they thought that they could do it, they should do it, but they identified many barriers within the schools to doing it. Time. They didn't have enough time. And so one teacher kind of sneaked it in, but she was teaching AP physics and it was really hard. But she said, we have to do it because what I get out of my students when I do this is she saw the connection and she did it. But the time and the expertise. They talked about having professional development, but the professional development unit on social emotional learning was often presented as kind of a standalone unit. Well, that doesn't help you integrate it into what you're doing in the classroom. Plus, they tended to be optional. And again, novice teachers aren't going to do it. They're going to do the other things. And so it kind of became a maybe someday for newer teachers to do. That was their observation of them. And so, but they did use data. Some of them collected data. They did their own surveys of students to find out what the students really needed and see how they could do it. They thought that it would be important to link to a communities and get other resources in communities for some of these students whose needs really are pretty profound. Some of the students in these areas. They were concerned that in an accountability system, the practices would become one size fits all. We're going to do grit. That's what we're going to do. We're going to measure it. We're going to do it. But that may not be the right thing for every student. And they thought it was really important to tailor this support to the needs of the students that they had. And there was also concern that because that other things in life affect your social and emotional learning outside of school. And teachers in high needs schools have students facing profound personal challenges like food insecurity or living in an unsafe neighborhood. And we don't want to see those teachers, in a sense, being penalized, being scored on something without taking into account what else the students are facing. So there was a lot of excitement about using data. to understand and help students with social emotional learning, but concern that it could be used in a way that wouldn't benefit teachers and students.
Great, thank you, Beth. And I'm going to probably circle back to you in a little bit to really zero in a little bit more on the evaluation piece. I'm going to go to Ulrich now, and Ulrich, your report was very different. It had a different focus than ours, but still the same overarching topic. So can you share some of the key takeaways from your report?
Yeah, I'm going to share some of the key takeaways. I mean, one thought that I had, and I'd love for us to come back to this idea, is, I feel like we think about social and emotional learning as standalone, right? But we're engaging it all the time. If my colleague here, if I sort of start to express dominance and like lean in, right? I mean, I'm showing a very sort of concrete form of, emotional sort of expression towards him. And I think it's very easy to underestimate that we're doing this all the time. And sort of the question in my mind, I'm curious how you guys have seen this rolled out and how you see sort of teachers and communities reacting to it. But we engage in it sort of all the time. I was even looking at all of us actually were folding our hands in the same way up here, right? And we were engaging in another form of just sort of mimicking each other. So I think that's really important. Also, going into the second position, going into our paper, right? Because what we argue is that, we are doing this all the time. And so the key issue is to get better at it, and we do see the new federal law as having some very important opportunities to encourage schools and districts that are wanting to take this on to do it with federal dollars. So, one, we underscore Title IV, which now offers some opportunities. I'm excited to see people like writing down Title IV as I look out into the audience, because these are, we think, are really important ideas. And Title IV does offer this very important opportunity to create research practice partnerships. We think that these are really a powerful way to engage school districts from the ground up, right? I mean, we don't have, to your great point, Beth, we don't have a model that works, so we're going to have schools and districts engaging this on the ground up. And so we see places like New York, Chicago, Stanford has done some nice work about this, partnering with local institutions to build programs that are going to work for them. We shared in our report some similar concerns, and this is quite clear given the way that federal law is around how are we going to measure this? Is this going to be included in accountability systems? There are some individuals like Roger Weisberg, who's really incredibly knowledgeable from Castle, who thinks, well, maybe some of these measures should be included in accountability systems, maybe quite small, but maybe have them as 1%. I think we share some of your concerns, and in our report tried to lay out some of the concerns that we have that around measurement, around gaming. Should we really use measures, whether it's school climate or chronic absenteeism? Those seem like better measures, but are you really measuring a kid's specific grit, or even worse, how close they might sit next to a colleague, which seems particularly gameable. And then, thinking through some of the other aspects of this, Title I, Part A is the largest source of money that goes out to schools, low poverty schools, from the federal government. There's a lot of flexibility around it. 56,000 schools around the country get this money, and it's quite clear now that schools can use this pot of money to help and encourage the development of social and emotional programs to develop learning mindset and skills. So we tried with our report really to lay that out there, right, to show ways in this can be done and the way that the law offers this type of opportunity. And then I think finally Title II, familiar to certainly many of the education wonks around Washington, allows also for the use of professional development monies to help teachers grow their capacities in this area. And your report, as well as a lot of other reports, show teachers are really clamoring for this type of development. More than 80% of teachers in an Ed Week poll said they wanted more knowledge on how to develop this. And I think what you often hear from teachers is, I've had enough of the new fad. And so I think there's often a danger when we roll out new programs. But what's very clear from the classroom is teachers are saying, no, we know this is important. We know this matters. Please help us roll this out.
So both of our reports are indicating that teachers see the importance of these skills. I'm going to turn to Amalio, who's now serving in the capacity as an administrator in that wonderful position that I mentioned earlier. How do you see the data from these two reports helping you to make the case for the need for teaching teachers how to teach students about these skills?
Well, thank you. Thank you for this opportunity. And I really appreciated the studies because both studies helped to validate for us some of the things that we're doing and yet posed some new things for us to consider. And as I thought about my work, I looked at three different areas. First of all, uh, I believe, like you do, Ulrich, that all learning is social emotional. And so it's happening all the time. And if so, then how do we make sure that we're integrating it? So integration was a key piece. And as I think about this, how do we provide learning through social emotional learning through a multi-tiered system of support? In Boston, we have our comprehensive behavioral health model, which sort of begins to look at how do we bring explicit cell instruction, but then also provide supports for those students who may need a deeper level of support at tiers 2 or tier 3. And so we're learning some lessons from there. Looking at how to integrate it in terms of opportunities and achievement gaps. So there in Boston, one of the things we're looking at is we have an Excellence for All program that we kicked off as an aim to reach out to some of our most marginalized students, particularly our Black and brown boys, and really looking at many of the things that both studies reference. How do we get in those executive functioning skills as well as social emotional skills to ensure that, again, we develop our students and that they're afforded opportunities that in the past were traditionally afforded to our students that were in our advanced work class programs. And so this is an opportunity for all our students to receive a high quality education. And as I'm thinking about this, our teachers are doing this work, and many of them, as you pointed out in the studies, are already doing great things. How do we get more of our teachers to understand that they're already doing it, and how can they make it more explicit in their instruction? So thinking about when they're working with students, can they in some way have their students reflect at the end of the lesson how they used grit or growth mindset in the course of a lesson, and how did the teacher elicit those skills and competencies within the course of the lesson? A second area that I thought about was professional development. And in Boston, and as the studies pointed out, teachers are clamoring for this. So our thinking has been, again, about the integration. How can we integrate this? And I was mentioning to the panelists earlier that in Boston, we're doing some deep work around equity and bias. And so then how is it that we can address bias and social emotional learning at the same time? And so it's helping develop professional development that helps our teachers first to seek to understand self in order to understand then the students that they're serving with. And so this work around social emotional learning is so much about the adults as well as our students. And I think we have to do some deep work ourselves. And so I've been working with my fellow assistant superintendents to develop professional development that gets at that. Yet we recognize some of the challenges with professional development. In Boston, for example, the teacher union contract dictates only 18 hours for professional development. And then anything else outside of that, it becomes voluntary. And so we are trying to figure out how do we entice teachers. And so for the first time this year, we're going to have a Teacher Summer Institute. We're open to as many teachers as want to participate. We'll pay them a stipend, and then we hope to provide some professional development, not just about SEL, but again, how it's integrated and helping our teachers see that. And then in terms of professional development, I'm wondering if we can encourage teachers to develop digital portfolios and even thinking around badging. And so as teachers gain these competencies and skills, can they have badges, if you will, that will again show that they've mastered these competencies? And then just some few thoughts around accountability. One of the conversations I've been having with our folks in our Office of Human Capital is, well, first of all, around this work, and again, talking about social emotional learning, learning skills, learning mindsets that conjure up all kinds of images, all kinds of definitions. Everyone thinks of social emotional learning differently. How do we come to common language around that and provide clarity for everyone, and then provide supports? I think that we can't lead with accountability, because first we have to provide clarity and supports around that. And some of the things that we're thinking about is that we already have our teacher evaluation system in place in Massachusetts. So this year we worked with our Office of Human Capital to be able to think about looking at all the teacher competencies that are being evaluated. Can we pick a couple that we can focus on, and not for the purpose of accountability, but rather for providing supports, and then really helping teachers to focus on building their skill sets and developing professional development. And then just yesterday, we were working with our Office of Human Capital to build small video vignettes for our teachers to understand what these competencies are. And so really tying it into things that they're already doing might be a way that we can do it. And in terms of accountability, the studies were talking about bias, and that's important to recognize. We talked about student bias. Yet I wonder I wonder where there is a place for youth voice, and that this might be an opportunity again to have student measures where they are able to provide voice, and that will help us to as educators to really provide interventions and services. And on the other hand, I've noticed with some teacher assessments that they also lend themselves to bias. So one of the things that we're thinking about is, can we come together and do some studies around looking at a teacher-based assessment, looking at a student assessment that gives student voice, and bring the two together, and can we find some common ground there?
Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts. And you mentioned a couple times the importance of teachers' self-awareness about social and emotional learning skills within themselves as well as within their students. So at this point, I'd like to turn to a teacher. I'd like to turn to Rebecca and ask her to share some information about what you learned in doing this study that you are applying in your classroom.
Sure. So what an honor it was to be able to work as a teacher researcher on this study and actually participate in the conversations with some really amazing educators who are doing tremendous things across the country. And for me, I think there were really two compelling pieces of the study that are still resonating with me, and I'm even spending some of my summer thinking about. The first one is the research and the parts of the conversation where we talked particularly about sense of belonging. I've seen firsthand how whether or not a student feels safe and supported and valued in the school environment can make the difference between whether or not we get that high school student even in the door. Sometimes that's the reason they walk in the building, because they know this is a great place to be, this is a place where I come and I can be recognized. And so the literature that we reviewed showed that sense of belonging can help increase academic performance, in fact, a whole range of academic measures. But how validating is it to be able to research that, to read that, knowing that absolutely this is something I know as a teacher from experience. The focus group participants also talked a lot about how important student-teacher relationships are for them, and how building those strong connections with students also helps them to be able to provide the support, encouragement, and engagement that moves the needle for students in terms of academic performance. And this also resonated with me from experience. I know that that has to be the place where I start. I can't teach anything if I don't know first and foremost who my students are and what they're bringing to the table. And so it's a really wonderful thing when you can actually see research and your experience come together in such a powerful way. So I think I'm going to be looking for even more ways in which I can cultivate those kinds of strong student-teacher relationships in my classroom and make that kind of connection making much more purposeful and, as Amalio said, explicit in my classroom. And the second piece or point from the study that I think was also compelling was the work around growth mindset. I was already familiar with Carol Dweck's work, but listening to the teachers in the focus group and looking at some of the other research that was out there, here is one of those components of social emotional learning that has a really strong research base. Some of those experimental intervention studies are really powerful in communicating just how much a difference we can make for students with some relatively small interventions. And I've seen firsthand the stunting influence of a student who thinks there's not even a reason to try because I'm already not good at X. Just fill in the blank. I'm not a good writer. I'm not a good reader. I'm never going to be good at math. And so as the teacher, it's my job to help the student overcome that particular mindset. Because if I can't do that, if I can't help a student change his or her perception of his or her own abilities, I'm not going to be able to move the needle on the academic performance measures in the way that I need to with that student. So that particular work has me thinking about ways and searching for the tools that Amalio is talking about creating for his teachers in Boston that are going to help me to make that kind of instruction more purposeful and more explicit in my classroom. So sometimes words of encouragement aren't enough. Simply telling the student a brain works like a muscle isn't enough to be able to fix or change that fixed mindset. And so it has me hungry and searching, in fact, all summer for the ways in which I can do that more effectively in my classroom for my students.
And Rebecca, you and I spoke at breakfast this morning about some personal examples of sense of belonging and how they played out in our families. We both have sons, and our sons seem to have some very similar characteristics in terms of not really seeing the value of going to school. And so that sense of belonging becomes extremely important. My son is a musician, and all that he cares about is music. And so we had to really consciously, not knowing that we were using, if I use this vocabulary, sense of belonging, not knowing that we were doing that at the time, but we had to create that sense of belonging for him by getting him enrolled in every blessed music class that his high school had to offer. And that was the reason that he would go to school. And I know that you're experiencing something similar with your son. So really making it real and meaningful.
And in particular, so I'll get comments sometimes from my son, I hate school, but I love Mrs. Simpson's classroom. Or I can't stand math, but you know what? Mr. Raymond really makes it fun. And I get it. Like by the end of the unit, I always get it. And so it's that space and it's that caring, enthusiastic, supportive, and available teacher who is making the difference for him one day at a time, one classroom at a time, that keeps him coming back for more. I've also found that not just for my students, but also for my son, when I can engage them in moments where they are reflecting and self-assessing and tracking their own growth day by day, week by week, that becomes a really powerful tool. Because it's not just me saying, you know, you're doing it, you're getting it. They're actually seeing and tracking their own progress. And once they see that little bit of success, they want more of it. And then they want more. And so it becomes a really positive cycle of reflection and assessment. And then I'm going to try X, Y, and Z even harder. I'm going to go after my learning in a more powerful way. I'm really going to take ownership of it.
One thing that I think is really an important outcome, not only of these studies, but of the other studies and the other work that has been done around social and emotional learning, intrapersonal learning, whatever terminology you wish to use, is that we are starting to form something of a common vocabulary around the terminology and what that terminology means when we talk about these things. So that came out in both of the reports, and it's also come out in listening to Amalio talk about the work that he's doing in Boston. So you mentioned when we met earlier in our waiting room that one of the first things that you did with your staff when you took this new position about 18 months ago was to start to try to form a definition of what does your district mean by social and emotional learning. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
I think one of the things we found was that when I first arrived in Boston, everyone was saying they were doing social emotional learning. And again, to my definition, they probably were doing some aspect of it. And so we began by engaging the entire community in a series of conversations. And shortly after I arrived in Boston, we held a one-day event called the Meeting of the Minds. And we started with Castle's definition, Castle, the Collaborative for Academic and Social Emotional Learning definition, and started to see how it resonated with the group. And we started finding out that for our community, that the definition provided by Castle, and in terms of the competencies, right, self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationships, decision-making, those were all relevant. But we also had to think about where did youth voice fit in? Were we looking at social emotional learning through a social justice lens? Were we looking at it through an equity lens? And so the visual for the model started to grow, as a matter of fact, as a result of that. And then some of the thinking also said, how can we access the standards, the skills, or the competencies from any point, so that it's not a linear piece, but rather, again, access at any point. And so as we've developed our standards, we've looked at Webb's depth of knowledge and sort of created the standards in that manner. And so there's an order of thinking, higher order thinking, but again, helping our teachers to be able to see that you start where the students are at, and then be able to access the standards, the skills, the competencies, if you will, from any point within that piece. And so another outcome of all of this effort is as we begin to work with our partners, and I was mentioning to my fellow panelists this morning that in Boston, we've identified over 300 partners who do social emotional learning in one capacity or another. And so as we've been working to identify funding streams and to develop common languages, is to develop guardrails for our partners, using our definition, using our expectations, so that way, again, our partners and working in collaboration with our school leaders and teachers then are targeting the same skills and competencies.
Thank you. Excellent. So all of you mentioned the importance of providing teachers with opportunities to learn about social and emotional learning. And Ulrich, you specifically mentioned that should Title II survive in some way, shape, or form, that there is room in there for professional learning around SEL. What kinds of skills do you think would be most important for teachers to learn regarding social and emotional learning, and how would you best recommend that they get them?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've now seen some programs, like my teaching partner out of University of Virginia. It's an online program. They've done some very nice studies of it that show very clear effects. I think when it comes to professional development and education, there's of course always this debate, is it really effective, and how we sort of navigate that. So I think looking towards programs that have really shown strong impact and doing our best, I think as a policy community, as a research community, to elevate those programs because we know that they work. The nature of Title II is that it is quite flexible, and so we have to think about, that flexibility is a good thing, but can also allow programs to, be rolled out that are less effective. I think what's interesting with when we talk about teachers, right, is really starting with the self. So, what we've seen in our research, right, is that, having teachers start to think about how they control their own stress, how they engage in more mindfulness, how they can really, in a very direct way, model these types of self-control is really important. And in ways, small and big, we do signal kind of a fixed mindset. And Catherine, I'm going to I do this to my colleagues a lot. We show fixed mindsets in all sorts of small ways. When you sat down initially and said, "Oh, this helps me explain why I was weak at math," was finger dexterity. Implicit in that actual comment is actually a type of fixed mindset. And so, how can we just in these very small ways do a better job to make sure that we are encouraging and really modeling these types of behaviors, even outside of sort of the direct classroom type experience. But curious, I don't know, Rebecca, Beth, what you guys think about this?
Interesting that you said that, because, and that was a theme in the focus groups, is how do we help our students develop these skills? We need to walk the walk. We need to demonstrate these skills ourselves and then develop relationships with students, and so that they'll see it. And again, this was really something that came through in that discussion, was the feeling that you have to do it yourself, and that will model it for students in a way that they may not get to see, in other settings. And so how important that is to do.
To Amalio's point about first building a common language and sort of a common definition, I think that's a really important piece for students and teachers to do at the sort of microcosmic level of the classroom as well. So not only do I become an important model of those kinds of skills, but I also have to have a common language in which I'm able to talk about and call out those kinds of behaviors or comments, and use a common vocabulary so that when I am making that explicit and purposeful for my students, they're using the same language back, right? And so when they start to describe their own behavior and their own mindsets, they've got a vocabulary with which to be able to do that, I think is really important. I think what I also heard from the focus group conversations was there's sort of this catch-22 that often happens in a system that has some really important competing priorities. And so the focus has been placed, the emphasis has for so long been on academic performance and academic content mastery, that I think there's this fear that all of a sudden, now especially if you make social and emotional learning part of an accountability system, that all of a sudden it's going to become this sort of sort of side by side in yet another competing priority, right? And so now where do I place my time, focus, and energy? How is it that we can, to Amalio's point, really begin to integrate this, to help teachers find the ways in which they can actually use social emotional learning and development and cultivating that in their students as a way in which to help their students actually make those academic benchmarks that are so necessary and emphasized. So I'm really encouraged by the sort of shift, or rather more of an expansion of view, right? We're taking much more of a whole child orientation here in focusing on social and emotional learning. But again, I would be cautious, because I wouldn't want it to become this thing that becomes very formulaic and very standardized. It has to be something that remains flexible, allows me to get very individualized, personalized information about what my students' unique needs are. And it has to be done in a way that is flexible for my entire system. My student population doesn't look the same as someone even one county over. And so what are those supports that are going to be unique to my district that are really going to help me to focus on developing these skills in my student population, both at the classroom level, the building level, and the district level?
One thing that I wanted to say, when I read, again, both pieces, and I was reading about some of the teachers' concerns about students in schools that are underperforming, and so dealing with issues around food, and so I'm wondering again, is that a fixed mindset, and how do we change that? I think about my experiences as a young man growing up in the streets of Chicago, in the Humboldt Park area, which is on a gang. A very heavy gang area, but I knew I had some street smarts, if you will, some things that helped me to survive and get to walk the 1 mile walk to school each and every day. And so when I think about our youth in urban settings, that they bring some assets to the table. And so how can we capitalize on those assets, and can we help our teachers to see that even some of our students who are in some very tough situations still show up on our doorsteps every day, because there's some level of resilience, and that there is some level of mindset and assets that they bring to the table. So how do we help our teachers to capitalize on that?
Catherine, can I jump in on that?
Please.
So yeah, I mean, we've thought about this a lot because on one side, I think people talk about, oh, there's this deficit model that we're saying that low-income students don't have this, and thus we have to provide it. I think just to provide a sense from the policy side, look, policymakers run on solving problems, and so that's just the nature of the game, if you will, and that's, if you're on the left or on the right, there's a problem, you want to solve it, and that's really what policy platforms are. And so we've struggled a lot with this, and I think, though, the counter to that is important, that if we want people to engage in this, we have to say, here's a problem, and here are ways that, we can solve it through levers, whether it's regulation, executive orders, or legislation.
That was going to lead me into the last two questions that I wanted to ask you before we go to these wonderful participants who've come out in the rain to be part of this conversation today. How do we go about engaging parents and getting them to buy into the importance of social and emotional learning skills in the classroom? And what would you want to say to policymakers about social and emotional learning? What would you want them to do? What would you want from them? So pick one of those and jump in.
Well, I think the sense of belonging also applies to the parents. They need to feel welcome in the school, that they can talk to the teachers and the principals too. I think that's kind of the outreach that needs to happen to get parents more involved with this.
I would agree. I mean, we've taken the approach of, we talk about social emotional learning, but more within the context of creating safe, healthy, and welcoming school environments for everyone. And so, or safe, welcoming environments, not even school environments, so that way it permeates from central office to the entire community. And so I think for us, how do we as educators walk the walk and talk the talk? As you pointed out, we've got to do that for parents and model it for them and show it to them and value them just as much as we value the children that they entrust to us on a daily basis. My one recommendation as policymakers and funders are out there is, policymakers is not to do more unfunded mandates, and that becomes a challenge for us to do the work. We've seen it, or I've seen it in my own experiences, like with bullying prevention efforts where policies are enacted, but there are no dollars, dating violence policies. And and I think another piece is that we continue to silo these pieces, so whether it's substance abuse prevention, violence prevention, bullying prevention, whatever prevention, teen pregnancy, that many of these issues we can address through developing the social and emotional competencies and skills of our students. And so there's a tremendous opportunity there.
I might offer a slightly contradictory view, and that is to say that not all parent involvement is great parent involvement. There's a wonderful study, my colleagues, I've mentioned this often, it's done by Sian Bylock, and what she was able to find is that parents who are math anxious, right, who stress about calculating the tip, they actually when you encourage them to participate, they transfer that anxiety to their children. Parents who are not math anxious don't transfer that anxiety to their children. So, I think we want parents to participate. I think, we want to make sure, though, that they're doing it in a way that's going to bolster student achievement. I think an overall sense of belonging is something that we should strive for, frankly, as a nation. Certainly in times today, we should strive for it in our communities, and no doubt it should be there in our schools. But thinking about how parents participate, in which ways can we leverage them to help their kids engage in school? But in some areas, where do we want them to have maybe less of a role? And if they're feeling stressed about, multiplication tables, I don't think, or at least the research suggests that, we should be hesitant about perhaps including them.
Anything else?
I'll just add that for me, when I think about social and emotional learning, I think this is the human work. of teaching, right? This is me face to face, nose to nose with my students, figuring out who they are, what they bring to my classroom, and how together we can help them become the best versions of themselves that they are and can be well after they leave my classroom. And again, I'm really encouraged that as a system now, we're actually expanding our view to not just those siloed skills, but really thinking about the whole student, the whole child. And that is why I think it is so important to lead with support, to borrow a phrase from Amalio. That has to be there first. You have to be able to equip everyone in the system with the tools, resources, funding, whatever that is that they need in order to be able to address all of it, right? In the most productive and powerful and effective way, in a contextualized way, something that makes sense for your system. Before then, you can expect there to be a particular set of results that then you're being held accountable for. So I'd love to see us put support before the accountability piece, and remember that this is the human work of teaching that makes it hard, and it also makes it rewarding, and there's no script. So help me populate that toolbox so that I've got every resource that I need to help students be the best versions of themselves that they can.
That's extremely powerful, what you just said. And I think, again, now I'll rethink my statement a little bit. And it's funny, I was leaning forward. But there are some things that are low cost, no cost. And this is one of those things, I mean, again, that the power of forming a relationship is very low cost, no cost. And we create that sense of belonging. I think that as I reflect now, let me lean back, as an educator, that's what made me a good teacher. My power to have relationships with students. I don't particularly think I was this dynamic, fantastic teacher, but it was my ability to know my students and understand them. And so if we can take the time to do that, I really think that we can really make some significant differences in the lives of our kids and ourselves as educators to feel good about what we do. When we've asked teachers, or when you ask students, again, I was thinking about your two boys, what do they talk about? They don't say, well, Mr. Nieves taught me how to do set design very well in our performing arts class, or he taught me how to measure well. Mr. Nieves taught me the value of hard work. Mr. Nieves taught me the value of caring. And so I think, that is the human work, and that is our work. And so it's just as important as the academic piece.
I'm going to turn to you now, and before we open it up for questions to help you get some questions percolating, I'd like to ask you to turn to an elbow partner, somebody that you're seated near, and have a conversation for about 60 seconds. What's one thing that you've taken away from this conversation so far? Go.
Well, at least from our earlier conversation, I was impressed at your effort on physical education. So I certainly, not sure if my mic's still on.
Are you happy
Maybe I
with
shouldn't
how
be
it's
chattering,
going?
but that was my certain
to?
takeaway.
Well, I really love your opening. But it made me think about that's a great way to really begin to start to help people to think about.
Do you see Kim?
Some of this can be so abstract.
Yep.
For people, so the more that we can tie it, make it visual, make
Do you
it
see
physical,
Kim?
then
Do you
thinking
see
about
Kim?
the different learning styles and create those types of analogies for folks, I think the more we can
Yeah,
draw them.
I admit that I thought about just standing above you before instead of leaning into you. I mean, I think,
If
to
you can
underscore
hear
the
me,
point.
snap
Actually
once.
farther east than that, but I know Butler
If you
and
can
Newcastle
hear me,
well.
snap twice. If you can hear me, snap 3 times. Thank you for having that brief conversation. And I'd like to open the floor up now to questions. We have a CAP member here with a microphone. This is being live streamed, so we'd like you to ask your question into the microphone. And let's start right here.
First of all, good morning. Thank you so much for this exciting forum. My name is Janice Farabee. I'm an author and founder of Farabee Enterprises International. It's a global female empowerment social enterprise, best known for the Got It Going On empowerment brand for girls of color. And as a result of being the first African-American models editor for 17 magazine back in 1979, almost 40 years ago, and the work that I did as a school-based social worker when I was getting my master's of social work from the University of Pennsylvania 20 years ago, I created a culturally customized service and social and emotional literacy program, curriculum, products, services, and training. And I'd like to know how to get better connected as a value-added asset to the work that you all are doing in creating the emotional quotient, as you were talking about, so that our children can achieve more of their intellectual quotient.
Anyone like to answer that? How can community-based organizations get more involved in social and emotional work in schools?
I'm going to look to you.
Well, again, I'm just going to speak from my own experience. In Boston, we have a partnership portal where our partners that are doing any work around social emotional learning or academics, for that matter, go in and sign in and answer a series of questions, and then they get added to the partnership database. And so when schools are looking for programs and services, or even central office, they can turn to that partnership portal and be able to access those programs and services. So that's one way.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you, when you ask your question, to please stand and state your name and your affiliation, and ask your question within about 10 seconds, or I'm going to ask you to move on. So can we go right here?
Hi, Luann McNabb with the National Council of Teachers of English. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi.
My question is how do you convince policymakers who keep giving mandates for testing and things like that to, one, integrate SEL in either the literature classroom or the physics classroom, and two, how to emphasize the importance of this so they understand that it's not just the academic achievement, but the happiness of kids who are going to go through life and do well?
Questions? Panel?
So just to clarify, your question is how can we convince policymakers that this is important?
That's one. And the other, how do you integrate it in the classroom when you have that pressure to achieve academically? You have to get those testing and things in.
Well, I certainly heard in the focus group conversations that was a real need, right? Teachers are hungry for ways in which they can better integrate. And I think Amalia's work is actually speaking to that in Boston. And it's interesting, as an English language arts teacher, I think it's actually, at least in my perception, it's probably easier for me to think about ways to do that. In a literature classroom, in a writing classroom, for example, growth mindset, I think about how a piece of writing in my students' English language arts classroom is never finished. It's never done, right? There's always an opportunity to go back and make it better, refine it, revise it. So that's just one quick example of a way in which I can use the subject matter in my classroom to help students develop a mindset that, keep at it and be persistent, and we're going to be able to make it better. In terms of the importance, the research is really clear that this matters. And so there's got to be a way to connect policymakers to this research in ways that it's going to be able to speak to them. I think hearing stories from educators on the ground doing the work is also really, really important. I think this is an area where teachers can be leaders in giving policymakers what it is that they experience every day, telling those stories about what this looks like and how powerful it can be when it's integrated and incorporated into the authentic day-to-day work of a classroom.
Great. Thank you. And I saw another hand over here.
Hi, Martha Holly Myers from Higher Achievement. I'm wondering how you all have seen the world of SEL being adjusted or becoming more nuanced as we're learning more about sort of daily and systemic trauma that students and the communities that we serve face. Like if a child is coming to school facing tremendous trauma in his or her daily life, encouraging them to just be grittier, and that will improve their academic performance and opportunities is often harmful. So how do you see this changing?
We've wrestled with that. And I would even say not just the trauma, but some of the secondary trauma that our teachers, our educators experience dealing with the trauma in their students' lives. And so as we, I think so much of this work is not just about teaching the specific skills and competencies, but creating, again, that culture, that climate in the classroom, in the school. So again, when we talk about sense of belongingness, it's that piece that students are coming in, and does my teacher recognize that something's going on with me? Did my teacher take time to say, how are you? How's it going? Or did my teacher leave me alone at that moment because I'm dealing with something? And so how do we, I think it's creating the conditions for students to be able to play out what's happening, and how do we let them know that we care and that we're concerned about them? So that's a key piece.
I think it's also part of that is you've got your partnerships in Boston, but I mean, if a teacher had a list of resources and numbers, and if these are the places to go, because a teacher may not be able to solve the kinds of traumatic problems that you're describing, but if we could just, these are the places to go in our town, and just something like that could help a child, get additional help, know how to do that.
I think a way in which it's also changing is that more than ever before, especially if I think about the first few years of my teaching career and where I am now, more than ever I'm being armed with information, right? Which is a really, really important component here. No one was talking about adverse childhood experiences and what that looks like, and how you can actually see that in the classroom, right? But now I'm being armed with that information, right? This is what they are. This is the influence and impact that they can have on a student's learning. This is what that might look like in your classroom, and here are some ways in which you can handle it. Here are some supports that are out there. Here are some community outreach organizations. So I think if we can continue to do that, arm teachers and systems with information about what that looks like in their classrooms and in their schools, and then beyond that begin to provide a network of supports that actually help us to address those concerns, then we're on the right road, I think.
We've also created some or helped our teachers to create calming spaces in their classrooms through a grant that we had received through the Massachusetts Office of Victims Assistance after the Boston Marathon bombing. For some schools that we were working with, creating these trauma kits for our teachers to have, and stress balls and all kinds of things, headphones, noise canceling headphones for students. And so helping teachers to create some places in their classroom also for their students, but I agree also having those deeper level of supports and resources for students who require deeper need.
Hey, right next to the woman who asked this question, and then a couple people behind her.
Good morning, Cosby Hunt, Center for Inspired Teaching. I'm really glad to hear you talking about belonging so much. And I'm curious about how young people's sense of belonging or need for belonging changes as they move through school. How is it different in the elementary student than the middle or the high school student? I know that's a big question.
Great question.
I mean, one thing that I'd say is, we think about this often for disadvantaged students, and this is an example from Josh Aronson, who pioneered a lot of the stereotype threat work, and he talks about, Google has hired a lot of sort of the best and brightest, and they feel very confident, and he was saying that he has some very simple ways to subject them to stereotype threat. and that is to, you know, bring them to a dating scene and encourage them to like walk up to people and ask them out, right? Because that is actually, you know, their view of themselves is not to be successful at that. And my point isn't here to kick dirt at Google, but as much as to say, like, we're all thinking about belonging all of the time. I think on the sort of age progression, you know, there's, I think, little doubt that, you know, middle schoolers and high schoolers have it even times two, right? That, you know, that sense of like, you know, is your hat tilted exactly correctly? Do you have the right jeans or sneakers on? You know, is sort of doubly important. But, you know, to me, I think we think about this as sort of, you know, something for kind of, you know, little kids. But, you know, this is really important for all of us. We all have identities, and you know, you can all make us feel sort of mildly uncomfortable, even people who, at least on their resumes, are wildly successful.
But I think that was part of the concern that came up in the focus groups, and also research, is that one size doesn't fit all with, you know, cultivating these skills. I mean, some research has shown that for the idea of a sense of self-efficacy, for girls, that drops off when they hit adolescence. Not so much for boys, but for girls, it does. What, you know, and so we really do need to think about how to tailor our interactions and interventions to what kids need.
And as a middle school teacher, I can absolutely verify that in middle school, a sense of belonging is incredibly important, perhaps more important than at any other time in a child's life. And then as they move into high school, as Rebecca has already talked about, building that sense of community, that sense of belonging within the classroom, within the school, can keep our children in school, can keep them until they graduate. But I would like to make the point that this continues even into higher ed. So beyond P12, creating that sense of belonging, that sense of support, that sense of a network that a higher ed student is a part of is incredibly important. So it goes beyond P12. And there was a couple people back.
Thank you. My name is Rachel Lazar, and I don't have expertise in the field, but I'm the founder and facilitator for the Woodrow Wilson High School Diversity Task Force, which is a DCPS high school here in Washington, D.C. And I also wanted to talk about sense of belonging, and I wanted, because that was my 60-second conversation and what I shared. And what I wanted to talk about specifically were structural changes to affect sense of belonging, because I think it's a tandem strategy, and I agree starting with the self and teacher exploration. I mean, I'm just thinking of, you know, the racial bias and expectations for teachers. The Johns Hopkins 2016 study is one that I've seen. And so, you know, we have a lot of work to do. Very valiant to keep moving in that direction. But I wanted to share with this group and with you guys a change that we're making next year at Woodrow Wilson High School to try to enhance sense of belonging, which we consider like a pretty decent sized change that we're modeling on Evanston Township High School in outside of Chicago, which is something that Dr. Campbell did over there. So we're actually changing our freshman year curriculum that all students entering Woodrow Wilson High School are going to take honors biology and honors English. So it's an honors for all curriculum, because we had a lot of students come in and testify before our diversity task force and say, I used to think I was smart, but then there started to be these, you know, our teachers didn't recommend us for those classes coming from Hardy, but the teachers coming from Deal recommended all of those white kids. And all of a sudden, starting freshman year, we didn't have that sense of belonging anymore. And so we're actually just, with support for teachers and scaffolding, new terms for me, familiar terms for the group, we're trying to make changes structurally to affect that. And I just wondered what other changes are available structurally for us all to think about in this space, and what you guys thought of that change.
So it sounds like an interesting program that you're instituting, and I think that your question is, what kinds of supports and systems changes can we make within our schools and districts?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting to me, my daughter is going to go to Deal for a few years. Both my nephews went to Evanston. These are enormous high schools. I believe Evanston is actually arguably one of the largest in the country, bigger than many colleges. And when we talk about systemic changes, I mean, you know, there is this debate about small schools, but one of the benefits of small schools is exactly that, right? That it's much easier to create a sense of belonging. It's much easier that teachers who don't necessarily have you, where a student isn't necessarily in a teacher's classroom, but would know that name or know that child's sibling. And, a lot of these things of belonging, as we've discussed, are these like very subtle little things. To go back to the, angle on your hat is really important for middle schoolers. It is a very subtle thing. Parents often are, not quite in tune to it. The other thing that, when we talk about diversity that I think is sort of important to acknowledge, right, is diversity is important. We know that it's important, but we also need to address the fact that it is uncomfortable, right? We feel more comfortable interacting with people who are like us, whether that's that we share the same sports team or the same skin color or the same religion. So we need systems to create that type of engagement because we know it's important for us as a community. We know that it makes us, better able to solve problems. We know this is sort of the nature of the 21st century and a community that works together. But we also need to be honest about who we are as human beings, and our nature as pack animals makes us more comfortable, even if it's just a matter of me liking the Knicks and someone else liking the Knicks. And so trying to think about that on a systemic side, I think, in my mind, is really important.
So I'm really excited that you're thinking about structural changes because it's not going to matter much what I'm doing in my individual classroom if there are structures within the whole system that are reinforcing something, for example, like fixed mindset, right? A tracking system would be a great example of that. So love that you're actually looking for ideas that can shift the entire system. I know that in those larger systems, sometimes building schools within schools has been proven to be really effective, creating sort of these smaller teams of teachers that see a cohort of kids on a daily basis and really get to know them and the names of their brothers and sisters and really get to know these families. I've also seen some advisory curriculums become really powerful tools where students meet with the same group of students and the same teacher every morning or every day for a particular period of time and really just focus on these kinds of social and emotional issues. And that same cohort of students with that same teacher move together year by year by year. And so think about how powerful and how deep those relationships can become if I'm with that same group from 9th grade, for example, through graduation. I've really formed almost a small family within that building that I know I can go to for support.
So I love the questions that we've been getting, but we're out of time. So I would like to ask each of our panelists to share in about 30 seconds a final thought. And Beth, can we start with you?
Sure. These skills are important, and we can collect and use data in ways that help schools better serve their students, but we've got to do it in a way that's linked to resources and that can't become punitive to our...
Rebecca?
Listen to the teachers. They live this stuff every day. They know how important it is, and they're hungry for the resources, the tools, and the supports that are out there to help them do it even more effectively.
I ditto that. Teachers are our greatest assets. I think they are a powerful force for change in our schools, and that we need to listen to them and support them so that they can be successful.
I think, dittoing what everyone else said and to add a little value to say and underscore, we have a policy opportunity under a new law that allows us to spend monies in new ways, to create new partnerships, to really develop this work, and we need to take advantage of that opportunity. But really the important insight I think that I've gained is to quote Rebecca, that this is the human side of education.
Thank you all so much. In closing, I'd like to again thank the Rakes Foundation for providing the funding for these two studies, for allowing two very different organizations, to invest the time and talents of their members to explore this topic deeply. I'd like to thank the Center for American Progress for hosting this event today, and I'd like to thank all of you. So thank you so much for being here, and let's continue this conversation online. Please share the reports. If you have questions, please email them in, and thank you so much for coming out.